Say that again so we're clear, I said, and my voice did not shake. I will not be spoken to like hired help in my own home. Before we continue, if you value women's achievements, consider subscribing. It's free and helps these stories travel. Now, back to the story. My name is Mara Santos. I am 34, female, and I live in Austin, Texas, in a one-story brick house on a corner lot with a pecan tree that drops leaves like confetti every October. I work as an operations coordinator for a commercial HVAC company on Ben White. I like order, I like lists. I keep a blue binder for home papers with tabs for mortgage taxes, insurance, utilities, and warranties. The first page is a laminated checklist that starts with smoke alarm batteries in January and ends with gutter cleaning in December. I set phone reminders for everything: 7:15 a.m. coffee, 7:30 a.m. feed the dog, 8 a.m. out the door. I married Daniel 2 years ago after 3 years of dating. He is kind in public, but struggles to stand up to his family. The loudest voice in that family is his father, Arturo, who believes rank is everything, and that rank comes with age and not with respect. The first time I met him, he said, "You seem organized. That will be useful if you marry into us." I took it as a joke and smiled. The second time he told me, "You take things too seriously." That was the warning I ignored. The house was not a gift. I worked for it. I saved for years. My mother and I moved a lot when I was young, and I promised myself that when I had a chance, I would buy something stable. I built my credit. I kept a 3-month emergency fund. When rates dipped, I started looking. I found the pecan tree house in April, made an offer in May. We closed in July. The title company asked who will be on the deed. I said me for now, because at that time, Daniel and I were only engaged. We planned to add him later after the wedding when we did a will and a trust. We never got around to it. The binder holds all the papers: warranty deed, title insurance, tax receipts, and a sticky note that says, "Travis County Clerk File Number." I liked knowing exactly where everything lived. Arturo never asked who owned the house. He assumed. He made himself at home without the courtesy of asking. He would come by unannounced and leave muddy boots by the door and say, "Where do I put my tool bag?" He put a big metal cooler on the back patio and scraped the legs across the concrete like he was marking his space. The first time I asked for a heads up before visits, he laughed and said, "Family does not schedule family." I said, "Here we do." He rolled his eyes. Daniel stared at his phone. I wiped the dirt he tracked in and told myself to pick my battles. The problem began to grow the month Daniel lost a small bonus he had been counting on. His mood dipped. Arturo said he would help by doing a few handyman fixes at our place. He came over with ladders and a drill and moved through rooms like a foreman. He told me, "Open the garage and bring the shop vac." I said, "I have a work call at 9. I can help at noon." He said, "Work call? Schmirk call? Know your place." That sentence hit like a slap. Daniel tried to laugh it off and said, "Dad is old school." I said, "Old school is not an excuse for rude." Arturo lifted a brow and said, "If you are under my roof, you follow my rules." I said, "I am under my roof, and you will respect that." He said, "Your roof? That is cute." The man buys the house. The woman chooses the curtains. We will see about that when we fix the gutters. I said the gutters can wait until Saturday. He said the gutters will wait when I say they wait. That was the day I started writing everything down. I kept a small spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer and logged each visit: date, time, what was said, what was done. I took photos of scuffed baseboards and muddy boot prints and the small dent he left in the drywall carrying a ladder around a corner. When I asked him to put felt pads under the legs of his cooler, he said, "You worry like a chihuahua." When I told him we would decide on home changes together, he said, "I have more experience than both of you combined. Sit down and learn." Daniel would freeze when those lines came. He loved his father and feared him. I loved my peace, and would not give it away. I tried soft boundaries. I tried scheduled visits. I tried prepared lists with tasks and times. Arturo ignored them. The day he said, "Know your place," he said it in front of his brother and two cousins who were there for a cookout. They laughed, and someone said, "Careful. Arturo, she looks like she bites." I said, "I do not bite. I document." I stood there with my notebook and wrote the time, 4:11 p.m. The words, "Know your place," and the effect. Laughter. Daniel asked me to let it go until after dinner. I said no. I will not let go of myself in my home. Something else happened next. Small but sharp, Arturo took my house key off the hook in the mudroom and slipped it into his pocket. I saw the motion and said, "That is my key." He said, "Relax. I am family. I might need to stop by, when you are not home, to get the ladder." I said, "Ask first." He said, "Adults do not ask to visit their own son." I said, "If you want a key, you ask me, and I will say no." He said, "Watch your tone." I said, "Watch your boundaries." He left the key on the counter like it was bait. I put it in a small lockbox with a code and hung the box inside a cabinet. I changed the code and did not tell Daniel because he would have told his father if pressured. I started to think like a manager again, because that is what I do at work. I make processes when people ignore polite requests. A week later, our thermostat app showed the house went to 75 at noon on a day no one was home. I checked the camera logs and saw Arturo's silhouette. He had used the garage keypad. Daniel had told him the 4-digit code months ago when he helped move a bookshelf. I asked Daniel to change the code. He said it will set him off. I said good. A boundary that sets someone off is a boundary that is needed. We changed it. Arturo called Daniel at dinner and demanded the new code. Daniel deferred and said, "Talk to Mara." I picked up and said, "We are not sharing access right now." He said, "Know your place. Give me the code." I said, "My place's owner." "No." He hung up with a laugh like a cough. I started reading and calling. Travis County Clerk for Deeds 512-854-9188. I wrote the number down. Then I called a locksmith and asked about same-day rekeying. The man said we can rekey all cylinders to a new key in an hour. Price was $189 for 5 locks. He said I could also add a keypad with a rolling code and logs. That would be more but useful. I wrote it all down. I called my cousin, who is a paralegal, and asked her about trespass when family is involved. She said trespass is trespass. Your deed is the deed. If you ask someone to leave and they refuse, you call APD non-emergency at 512-974-2000 and request an officer to keep the peace. You do not need to scream. You hold your papers. You speak calm. I printed the deed and placed it in a clear sleeve behind the front page of my blue binder. I also took care of small things. I installed a latch on the side gate so no one could stroll into the yard. I moved the garage remote from the visor to the drawer. I made a new code for the keypad and wrote it nowhere. I told Daniel my plan, calm and simple. I said I will not fight in circles. I will make a line and stand on it. He said, "You are making too big a deal." I said, "I am making a clear deal, respect or removal." He said, "He is my father." I said, "And I am your wife and the owner of this house. And both can be true, but I will not be erased." He stopped talking then. I saw the boy in him and felt pity. But I would not be the one who kept paying the adult price for his fear. The visit that broke any doubt came on a Sunday. I had meal prepped and the kitchen smelled like garlic and lemon. A football game was on low. My dog dozed by the sliding door. The doorbell rang at 2:03 p.m. Arturo walked in when I opened the door. Not a hello, just a statement. "I'm here to replace your front lock with a better one." He held a box with a lock set like a trophy. I said, "We are not replacing anything today." He said, "The screws on yours are cheap. A thief can kick this in." I said, "We will schedule a time if needed." He set the box on the entry bench and opened it. He started unwrapping plastic with brisk little snaps. Daniel came in from the garage and said, "Dad, maybe another day." Arturo said, "Stand aside." He pointed at me with the small screwdriver from the box and said, "You don't understand how the world works. You are the woman. Know your place. Let the men handle the door." I felt the blood leave my face and gather again behind my eyes, not as tears, but as heat. But my voice stayed level. I said, "Leave my home." He said, "I will when I am done securing it." I said, "Leave my home now." He said, "Make me." Daniel stood between us and said, "Dad, please." Arturo stepped around him and knelt to remove the strike plate. I walked to the kitchen drawer and took out my phone and the blue binder and put both on the hall table. I said again, "Leave my home or I will call the police to keep the peace." He scoffed and said, "You won't. You're a yapper, not a biter." I called the non-emergency number and explained. I said, "A person has refused to leave my property, and I am the owner. Here is my file number." I gave my name and address and waited. Arturo talked loud about snowflakes while he fiddled with screws. Daniel kept saying, "Dad, stop." 10 minutes later. 2 officers stood at the door, a woman and a man. They asked what was going on. I held up the clear sleeve with the deed and said, "This is my house. I have asked this person to leave, and he has refused." The woman officer said, "Sir, you need to step outside." Arturo said, "This is my son's house." The male officer looked at me. I said, "Deed, in my name only." He nodded and asked Arturo to step out to talk. Arturo went red. I thought he would refuse. But he went. Because badges change the math for men like him. The officers spent 6 minutes outside with him, then came back and said, "We recommend you come back when invited." The woman officer turned to me and said, "If anyone enters without permission, you can call us again." I said, "Thank you." They left. Arturo stayed on the sidewalk and shouted that we were ungrateful, that he raised a weak son who hides behind his wife, that we would be sorry when we needed him. He pointed at me and said, "Know your place." And then he made a vow. "I will come and go as I wish. You will not stop me. Watch." He got in his truck and left with a rev of the engine like an exclamation point. That night, Daniel asked me to apologize to keep the peace. I said, "I will not apologize for protecting my peace." He said, "You backed him into a corner by calling the police." I said he backed himself there by refusing a simple request. Daniel went to shower and I sat with my binder and my notebook and my quiet dog and thought about the words we let men say because we want the easier hour. I decided there would not be a next time. I circled 3 items on a note. Call locksmith, call HOA, call county. In the morning, I did all 3. The locksmith set an appointment for Friday at 8 a.m. The HOA manager confirmed that only the owner of record can authorize changes to exterior locks if the locks match the color and style. I requested a compliance letter and she emailed a PDF by noon. The county clerk's office confirmed my deed is recorded and sent a certified copy by mail. I also emailed our insurance agent and asked about coverage for lock changes after a trespass incident. He said, "Fully covered, no impact on premium." I printed that email and added it to the binder. I felt calm, not angry, because a plan is a bridge. On Tuesday, Arturo tried a different approach. He sent a long text to Daniel about family loyalty and sacrifice. He said he had stored a heavy compressor in our garage last year and needed access to pick it up. He said he was coming at 6 p.m. Daniel read it to me while we stood by the sink. I said, "Tell him no. Schedule another day when both of us are home." Daniel typed, "Please wait until Saturday." Arturo replied, "Coming tonight. Do not lock me out." Daniel went pale. He said, "Maybe we should let him take it and then this ends." I said, "It does not end when we give in. It ends when we stand." He paced. He asked if we could have one night without war. I said we can have many if we end the siege. I wrote down 5:42 p.m. text incoming. I set my phone on the counter with the camera log open. At 6:03 p.m., the driveway camera pinged. Arturo's truck stopped at the curb. He walked up the path. He tried the door and found it locked. He knocked like a drum. I opened the door on the chain and said, "We are not doing this tonight." He said, "I will call a locksmith and get my tool." I said, "A locksmith will not open a home without the owner present." He said, "You are not the only owner." I said, "Check the records." He said, "Know your place and get out of the way." I closed the door and called non-emergency again. When the officers arrived, Arturo stayed by his truck. He did not want to repeat. They told him to leave. He left. I watched his taillights and felt that quiet heat return behind my eyes, the heat of a settled thing. The next day, I had lunch in my car and wrote a list titled Receipts. I listed the dates, the words, the officer's visit, the HOA letter, the locksmith quote. I called my bank and asked about adding a notice to the mortgage record that no changes can be made without my signature. The banker said, "Your mortgage already requires the borrower's approval for any transfer." I asked for a note on file anyway. She did it and emailed me the confirmation. I added it to the binder. I called a small law office a friend recommended and asked for a consult. The attorney, Ms. Nguyen, said what you describe is common. Set a boundary in writing. Tell him he is not allowed on the property without your express permission. Hand deliver it. And if he violates it, file a trespass affidavit with APD. She emailed a one-page template. I filled in names and address and printed 3 copies, one for Arturo, one for my file, one for APD if needed. I put a sticky on the top that said deliver Friday, 7:45 a.m., because Friday at 8 a.m., the locksmith would be there, and I planned to settle the issue in the daylight. That night, Daniel asked me what I hoped to prove. I said, "I am not proving, I am protecting." He said he feels caught between us. I said, "You do not need to be caught if you stand." He said, "You know how he is." I said, "I know how I am. Calm until I am not. But I am still calm." I told him my plan. Deliver the letter. Rekey the locks. Remove the garage keypad. Add a smart deadbolt with unique codes. Give you a code, not give him anything. And then hold the line. He shook his head and said, "He will explode." I said, "Then he explodes outside, not inside." Thursday night, Arturo tried one more tactic. He called my mother. He found her number from the wedding list and told her that her daughter was tearing a family apart. My mother called me after and said, "Be careful." I can hear the control in his voice. "Do what you need to do." I said I will. She said, "I raised you to build bridges but not to let a bully live under them." I laughed for the first time in days. I slept better that night. Friday dawned cool. The pecan leaves skittered along the walk at 7:20 a.m. I brewed coffee and set out the papers on the entry table. Deed, HOA note, attorney letter, at 7:42 a.m. A truck door slammed. Arturo was early. He rang the bell. I opened the door and stepped out and closed it behind me so the dog would stay back. I held the letter and said, "I am delivering this notice. You are not permitted on my property without explicit permission. Here is a copy for you." I handed it to him. He took it and crumpled it, and then smoothed it like he wanted to show he could still control the page. He said, "Little girl, know your place?" I said I do, and I pointed to the concrete at my feet. "This is my place. This is my line." The locksmith van turned the corner and parked. The man stepped out and waved. Arturo looked at the van and then at me. He said, "You think changing locks will change the hierarchy?" I said, "I think changing locks will change the access at 7:58 a.m. The locksmith brought his tool bag to the door. Arturo took a step as if to block him. I said, "If you step closer, I will call the police again." The locksmith paused and said, "I can come back." I said, "No. Please proceed." Arturo spat on the ground and said, "This is war." I said, "No, This is order. He left then, at least for that hour. The locksmith worked while I stood by. We changed the front, back, garage, and the side door to the laundry room. We added a smart deadbolt to the front. I created 2 codes on the app. One for me, one for Daniel. I showed the locksmith the deed, because he said it was company policy for rekeys when the person is not already in their system. I appreciated that. He installed new strike plates with 3-inch screws. He showed me how the deadbolt logged entries by time, 9:17 a.m. First test. I paid with my card and signed the receipt. $189 plus sales tax and the cost of the smart lock. Total $347.84. I placed the receipt in the binder. At 10:12 a.m., Arturo texted Daniel. Did she change the locks? Daniel typed a slow, yes. Arturo wrote, you will pay for that. Daniel did not reply. At noon, I drove to the post office and sent a certified copy of the notice to Arturo's address to have receipt on file. I kept the slip. I sent a copy to Ms. Nguyen by email. She wrote back good. Now hold the line. At 3:30 p.m. I sat on the patio and listened to a squirrel scolding the world from the pecan tree. The dog snored. My phone vibrated. A camera alert. Driveway motion. Arturo again. I watched on the live view as he tried the front door, then the side gate. Then he stood in the yard and made a call. 2 minutes later, a mobile locksmith van pulled up behind him. My heart climbed into my throat and I started the app for the smart deadbolt. I waited. The locksmith walked up, and I opened the door with the chain on and said, I am the owner and I did not request service. Please leave. The locksmith looked back at Arturo and then at me and said, do you have proof of ownership? I held up the clear sleeve with the deed and he nodded and apologized and left. Arturo cursed under his breath and said, you are embarrassing this family. I said, I am protecting this home. He said, you cannot keep me out forever. I said, watch me. He stepped closer and I stepped inside and closed the door. My hands shook for 60 seconds and then settled. The app log showed 3:37 p.m. tamper alarm cleared. I exhaled and started a pot of rice, because sometimes you do the next small, ordinary thing to remind your body the world is still here. That evening, Daniel sat across from me and said, I never wanted it to be like this. I said, neither did I. But we do not control other people's choices. We control ours. He said he is going to cut me off. I said then he makes his choice. But my door will not be a revolving door for his moods. He looked down at his hands, long and careful hands, the hands that had built bookshelves with me and held the dog's head when she was sick. He whispered, I am scared of losing both of you. I said, I will not make you choose, but I will not let you pretend there is no choice. He nodded and went to bed early. I sat with the quiet and the binder and the dog, and I made one more list. Saturday grocery, Sunday laundry, Monday call the county again to ask about a notice of non-consent for rekey requests. I wrote it down, because writing turns fear into boxes that can be checked. Sunday morning, Arturo struck in a new way. He posted on Facebook a long paragraph about disrespectful wives who drive wedges. His friends chimed in. A cousin tagged Daniel. I did not reply. I took screenshots with timestamps and saved them to a folder labeled October Notes. I went for a walk and counted driveways. 1, 2, 3, 4. I practiced my breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 6. When I got back, Daniel said he wants to come over for a talk at 5. I said no. He can meet us in a public place at a time we choose. Daniel texted that, and Arturo wrote back, I am coming at 5. Do not lock me out. At 4:48 p.m. The cameras pinged. He arrived early. He walked straight to the door with his own new lock set in a bag. He pounded like a drumline. I did not open. He went around to the back and tried the slider. The new latch held. He called Daniel and screamed, I watched the log and recorded a video clip from the camera at 5:01 p.m. He kicked the bottom of the door hard enough to rattle the frame. The dog barked and then looked to me for direction. I stayed calm. I called 911 this time because he had moved from refusal to leave to attempted forced entry. I said, "I have a trespasser. I have warned. Here is my address. Here is the deed. Please send officers." They came. They told him to go. He yelled. They warned him. He left with a finger stabbing the air. "This is not over," he shouted. I stood at the door and did not follow. The officers asked if I wanted to file the trespass affidavit now. I said yes. They gave me a card and instructions. I wrote the case number on a sticky and placed it in the binder. After they left, I made tea. Chamomile with honey. My hands were steady again. I looked around the small house I had chosen and paid for and loved, and I thought about the line he kept using. "Know your place." I whispered my answer to the empty room. My place is here. My place has a deed. My place has a lock that listens to me. My place has a woman who will not be moved by a man's volume, only by his respect. The next morning, I took the affidavit to the substation and filed it. The clerk stamped it and gave me a copy for my records. I drove home in the soft gray of a Texas morning and set the paper in the binder and closed it with a click. Daniel stood in the doorway and asked, "Is this forever?" I said, "The boundary is forever. The relationship can change if he changes." He said, "What if he never does?" I said, "Then we live in peace without his storms." He nodded, and for the first time he did not argue. He put his hand on the binder and said, "Thank you for holding us steady." I said, "Thank you for standing with me today." I kissed his palm and turned on the kettle, and while the water heated, I opened my notebook and wrote the date and a single line. "The war is not ours. The line is." I did not know it then, but the next step would not be another argument. It would be a twist grown from a small line in a file that most people overlook. A line about a transfer, right I had set up with our bank when we closed. A right that would decide who truly controlled entry to this house. Not for a day, but for good. And it would lead to one more scene at the front door, not with officers, but with a notary, 2 witnesses, and the quiet sound of a pen moving across a page, while a man who shouted about rank discovered that paper can be louder than pride when the paper is the deed. The small line in the file was in the closing packet from my bank, an option I had checked without thinking it would matter this much later. It read, "Ownership may be transferred to a revocable living trust at any time without lender consent so long as the borrower remains a beneficiary and occupant." I had chosen it because an older coworker told me, "Trusts make paperwork easier when life gets messy." Now life was messy. I called Ms. Nguyen and asked if we could set up a simple trust with me as trustee and Daniel as successor. No new mortgage, just a deed into trust and a short certificate I could show to anyone who asked who controlled the property. She said yes. "We can do that this week. Bring your current deed, your ID, and choose a name." I chose the Pecan Corner Trust because the tree had watched me through this whole thing and did not judge. She drafted a warranty deed to trustee and a short certification of trust that did not list assets, only said who was in charge. I read every line aloud at my kitchen table at 8:41 p.m., with the dog at my feet. The next day at 4 p.m., we met at her office. She explained that a trust does not make magic, but it makes authority clear. A trustee has the power to permit or deny entry and to act for the property without debate. I signed in blue ink in front of a notary. Daniel signed as successor, not manager, because we agreed I would continue to steer the house decisions until he proved he could hold the line with his father. The filing fee at the clerk's office was $36. We recorded the deed Friday morning, and Ms. Nguyen handed me 2 documents in a clear sleeve: the certified deed into trust and the certificate of trust. both with raised seals. She said, "Keep one by the front door. It will save breath." I added them to the binder behind the old deed like stacking shields. I did not tell Arturo. I did not post. I did not gloat. I watered the basil. I tightened the cabinet hinge Arturo had stripped with his hurry. I went to work and answered emails about rooftop units in Round Rock. At lunch, I ordered a small sign online that said "No trespassing, criminal trespass affidavit on file." I also printed a one-page house rule sheet that read, "Entry by invitation only, written permission required. Please text before arriving." It was not for Arturo, really. It was for me. A reminder that a boundary is not a mood. It is a policy. On Saturday, we tested the new deadbolt codes again. 10:02 a.m. Log ping. Everything worked. At 10:17 a.m. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel's aunt. "Family dinner at Tito's on Sunday. Can you both come?" I said yes. Neutral ground. A good test. We arrived Sunday at 5:28 p.m. And I kept my back to the wall, because that is how you hold yourself steady when you expect a wave, making sure you feel the wall and not the room. Arturo walked in at 5:47 p.m. with two cousins. He smiled a wide smile with no warmth. He hugged Daniel and ignored me. I said, "Good evening." He said, "We will fix that lock situation tomorrow." I said, "There is no lock situation." He leaned close and said, "Know your place." And I said, "My place is trustee." He blinked. He had expected a fight or a flinch, not a word he did not use. He said, "Trustee," like it tasted bad. I said, "I hold the deed in trust." He waved a hand. "Paper games. I build houses." I said, "Paper decides who opens the door." The food came and I ate slow, fork small, breath slow. And I did not argue, because the argument was over. Only the enforcement remained. Monday, 3:12 p.m. My phone showed driveway motion. Arturo again. He tried the front door, then the side gate. He rang the bell and held it down like a siren. I opened the door on the chain and held up the clear sleeve with the certificate of trust. I said, "Entry by permission only." He said, "Let me in." I said, "No." He said, "I am your husband's father." I said, "And I am the trustee of this home." He pointed at the seal and laughed. "A stamp," he said. "I have stamps too," but his laugh had an edge, the kind that covers a thin fear. He said, "Open or I will take the hinges off." I said, "If you touch my door, I will call 911 and hand them this." I tapped the certificate. He muttered something about paper tigers and went back to his truck. I watched from the window as he took a photo of the house and texted someone. The app pinged at 3:27 p.m., tamper alarm at the side gate. I reset it and wrote the time in the notebook. At 7:05 p.m., he posted a video on Facebook railing about disloyalty. I did not watch. I cleaned the stove grates instead because my hands like simple work. After a hard talk, Daniel sat at the table and said his father had always been like this. I said, "Your father has always been allowed to be like this." He rubbed his face and said, "I know." Tuesday afternoon, Miss Nguyen called and said, "APD confirmed your trespass affidavit is active for 1 year. Renew if needed." She also said if he tries a locksmith again, you can state in writing that no vendor has permission to touch your doors without you present. I wrote a short letter that said exactly that and taped it by the bell. I added a new camera facing the side gate because sunlight at 4 p.m. had been washing the frame out. I stood in the yard and counted my breath again. My dog pushed her head into my knee. I smiled and felt my mouth remember softness. Wednesday was quiet. I cooked a rose caldo and sent a container to my neighbor. Thursday at 6:41 p.m. The app showed front door motion again. When I checked, it was not Arturo. It was a man in a polo shirt with a clipboard, a mobile locksmith again. I opened the door on the chain and said the owner did not order service. He said, Mr. Santos did. I said, "This house is controlled by a trust and the trustee is me. Show me the work order." He showed his phone. The client name was Arturo, not Daniel. I held up the certificate and said, "Do not step on this property." He stepped back and said, "Sorry, ma'am, we don't touch doors when ownership is in dispute." I thanked him and he left. I took a photo of his van and sent it to Ms. Nguyen for my file at 7:02 p.m. I got a text from Arturo that said, "Open the house on Saturday. We are having a men's work day." He attached a flyer for Santos Family Fix and Feast. I laughed. Short, not happy, because the audacity would be funny if it did not chew your quiet. I replied, "No, do not come." He replied, not asking, telling. I did not answer. I went to the garage and checked the breaker panel labels and the water shutoff. Because when someone cannot get through the front door, they will try the knobs you forget. I set a padlock on the side gate. I added a small camera inside the garage. I slept with my phone on the nightstand and the binder on the dresser. Saturday at 9:10 a.m. The trucks arrived. 2 of them, cousins and an uncle, metal clanging in the beds, a cooler that looked like the one that scratched my patio. They came up the walk like a parade that assumed its own welcome. I stepped outside with the binder and locked the door behind me. Daniel stood next to me, not in front of me, and that mattered. I said, "This is private property. The trustee does not grant permission for entry or work." I held up the certificate so every eye could see the raised seal. The uncle swaggered and said, "Since when do women run job sites?" I said, "Since paper ran houses." And then I did the one thing I had promised myself I would do if we reached this point. I called for a neutral. I dialed the non-emergency line and said, "We have a crowd refusing to leave after a trespass affidavit. Please send officers to keep the peace." Arturo rolled his eyes and said, "You love cops because you want someone else to do your fighting." I said, "I love peace and policies." 12 minutes later, the same woman officer from before stepped out of her cruiser with a second officer. She recognized me. I handed her the certificate and the stamped trespass affidavit and said they planned to enter and replace fixtures without permission. She looked at Arturo and said, "Sir, the trustee of this property has told you to leave. If you enter, you can be arrested for criminal trespass." He blustered and said, "My son lives here." The officer turned to Daniel and asked, "Do you grant them permission?" Daniel looked at me, then at his father, then down at his shoes, and then his chin lifted a little, like something inside him had finally put on its own boots. He said, "No, I do not. I follow my wife's lead in our home." The officer nodded and said, "Gentlemen, leave now. If you return, you will be cited or arrested." One cousin started to argue, and the second officer gently rested his hand near his belt, and the argument died. They left with a rain of mutters and exhaust. Arturo lingered. He pointed at the pecan tree and said, "When that tree drops a branch on your roof, do not call me." I said, "I will call a licensed roofer with a contract." He said, "You think paper will keep you warm when family is gone." I said, "Paper kept me safe when family tried to break in." He spat a word I won't save here and drove away. The sound of his truck faded, and for the first time in weeks, the air around the house felt like it belonged to the sky again. That evening at 7:03 p.m., Daniel sat with me on the porch steps and said, "I am sorry I let it get this far." I said, "I am sorry you had to choose." He said, "I should have chosen years ago." I said, "You chose today." He nodded and wiped his eyes the way men do when they still think tears are a report card. I reached for his hand and said, "We can make new habits like we made new locks, one screw at a time." He smiled and said, "Okay, small steps." We made a list, not for Arturo, for us. Counseling for Daniel to unlearn fear and guilt. A schedule for family events only in public places for now. No surprise visits. Shared scripts for phone calls that say we will call you back. And then we do, when we are ready. The next morning he called his father and said, "I love you, but I will not let you disrespect my wife. If you want to see me, we meet at a coffee shop. No talk about the house. No insults." Arturo hung up. 2 days later, he sent a text that read, "I raised a weak man." Daniel did not reply. A week passed. No knocks. The dog slept heavy again. I put my blue binder back on the shelf instead of the table. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the county saying the deed into trust had been indexed. The copy had that crisp black stamp at the top that says recorded. I slid it into the binder and added a sticky that read, "Quiet kept." That same afternoon, the notary and 2 witnesses came to our house for something small that felt big. Ms. Nguyen suggested we sign a homestead affidavit and designation of trustees' powers, a simple document that restated in plain language that the property is our homestead and that I hold the powers to manage entry and security. The notary stood at my door. We all signed on the entry bench where Arturo had once dumped his lock set. The pen skated smooth. I paid the notary $40, cheap for the feeling of a line turning from pencil to ink. When they left, I stood there listening to the house. Houses have a sound when they rest, a soft hum of fridge and AC and wood. It sounded like the quiet after a long rain. A month later, the twist I did not expect came. Not from Arturo, but from the bank. A routine escrow audit lowered our monthly payment by $19 because of a tax adjustment. I smiled at the small win and then noticed the line I had not seen before because I had not needed it. It said, "Authorized caller list. Trustee only." It came from the trust certificate I had handed the mortgage servicer. It meant when Arturo tried, as he did, to call the bank and ask about adding my son to the title, because a cousin told him you can do things by phone if you sound confident. The bank said we cannot discuss this account with you, sir. He called Daniel after, furious, saying a woman at the bank had disrespected him. Daniel said, "Talk to the trustee." Arturo did not call me. He did, however, show up at a barbecue at Auntie's and say in a loud voice that paper had stolen his son. I was not there. But someone sent me a clip. I did not reply. I watered the basil again. 2 months of quiet passed. The trespass affidavit sat in the folder like a coiled rope I did not need to throw. I changed one code on the lock, because that is maintenance. Like oil changes, Daniel met his father 3 times at a coffee shop. Each time he used the script, coffee only, no house talk, no insults. When Arturo tried to go there, he said, "Not today, Dad," and stood up when it did not stop. The 3rd time, Arturo stayed on safe topics for 20 minutes and then asked for the garage code. Daniel said no, and that was a small miracle. December came. The pecan tree went thin. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived with Arturo's handwriting. Inside was a single page, no apology, not the way movies do it with big words, just a line that said, "If there is a leak, call me. I know a plumber who won't overcharge you." And below that, a set of copied keys taped to the paper with blue painter's tape. I held them in my hand, 3 silver shapes that had felt like a threat before. Now returned without drama. I put them in the lockbox on the pantry shelf and closed it. That night, I told Daniel I had an idea for a compromise that was not a surrender, an emergency plan that did not give up the boundary. I bought a small realtor lockbox for the gas meter, set a one-time code feature on it, and inside, I placed a spare key on a tag that read, "Emergency use only. Call trustee for code." I took a photo and emailed it to our neighbors and to Auntie with a simple note. "If anything happens to us and you need to get our dog out or turn off water, text me and I will send the code." I did not send it to Arturo. Not yet. Respect earns codes, not blood. A week later, I gave the same photo to Daniel and said, "This is how we share help without giving up the door." He nodded and kissed my temple and said, "I like this. Rules that care." On New Year's Day at 11:07 a.m., there was a knock. Slow, not loud. I opened the door to find Arturo standing there alone with no cooler and no crew. He looked smaller, or maybe the noise around him had finally shut off. He said, "I brought tamales." I said thank you, and stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me, because boundaries do not take. Holidays. We ate one each on paper plates on the steps. He stared at the street and said, "Your father taught you to be tough." I said, "My mother taught me to be kind with a spine." He nodded like that made sense in a language he had not studied enough. He took a breath and said, "I won't ask for a key." I said, "Good." He said, "If you need a ladder, call me." I said, "If I need a ladder, I will call a rental place. And maybe I will call you too if the rental place is out." He half smiled. We sat a while and then he stood and said, "Tell Daniel I said Happy New Year." I said I will. He went to his truck and left without trying the door. That afternoon, I cleaned the kitchen and thought about how people change slow, and only if they want to. How paper is not love, but it gives love a fence to grow behind. How a sentence like, "Know your place," can turn into a map if you answer it. My place is here, with a deed and a trust and a dog who sleeps in sun puddles, with a husband learning to stand with his own legs, with a family that meets in public and goes home separate, warm in their own rooms. My place has keys I control, and a code I can change, and a rule by the door that says, "Invitation only." My place is the quiet when I turn the deadbolt at night, and the lock answers back with that soft click that sounds like a full stop at the end of a sentence, the one I wrote for myself, the one I enforce with paper, with policy, and with a calm that men who shout will never understand, not because they cannot, but because they do not want to. And that is not my problem to solve. My problem was the door, and the door is mine, and it is closed until respect knocks.